All right.
Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have Lucy Biven back. She has a new book. It's called The Shortcut to Understanding Affective Neuroscience. And I have recruited my friend, Michael, who has graciously agreed to do the interview. So we'll be doing this together. But mostly it's going to be led by Michael. Michael was the one who introduced me to the work of Jack Panksepp. So take away, Michael. And Lucy, go ahead.
Okay.
Great. Well, I'm very excited and honored, and thank you for being here, Lucy. I wanted to know if you could sort of start off with a bit of your background and how you got into the space.
I was trained at the Anna Freud Center in child and adolescent psychotherapy. And at the time, I knew nothing about neuroscience. I had no interest in neuroscience. And then in 1993, I was living in Ann Arbor at the time, and there was a custody case of a woman had given birth to this child, and she gave the child up for adoption. But before the adoption was finalized, the couple who wanted to adopt her took the baby into their home. She was only a few days old, and the biological mother changed her mind. And due to certain vagaries of the law, which I don't completely understand, it was her right to have this child back. And the court ruled in her favor, but the custodial parents refused to comply. And somehow, again, I don't understand the legal aspects of this, but a local judge sided with the custodial parents. And one way or another, this whole case went on for 2.5 years, finally ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the biological parents. And apparently, from what I understand, they had the law on their side all the time. So a lot of the child and adolescent psychoanalysts in Ann Arbor were very up in arms about this. They thought it's terrible, and they were very supportive of the custodial parents. But after the court ruling, they needed somebody to implement and devise and implement a strategy for the transfer of custody. And somebody called me up. Before then, I had no dealings with the case. I had nothing to do with it. And then with that phone call, I was thrown into it. And there was already a protocol in place that I used. So that part was easy. And I was worried about it, because I had been taught that a transfer of custody at this age would be catastrophic to a child. But there had been one incident of a similar situation. We had seen a film of it, and I remember this is when I was a student, and then when we went back to the common room, some of the senior analysts were saying, I don't think this child was traumatized. I think this child was okay. So that sort of gave me hope. But in any case, everything went swimmingly. And this child did very, very well. I visited her for a number of times at her new house in Iowa. She was fine.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting story. I'm curious. So it seems like that almost like ties to my next question of, this question of, what is it useful for of all these emotions? Like, why do we study this? What is the motivation here? And it seems like you're getting into like, there's legal aspects, there's also ethical aspects. Is what can you possibly do as a psychologist?
Well, let me just expound just another couple of sentences. So I searched the psychoanalytic literature. Was there another case like this? And there wasn't. And there were a few cases in social work files of children who did well under similar circumstances, but I couldn't find an answer. So I turned to neuroscience, and that's where the answers lay. And so the idea is that psychoanalysis says, the teachings of John Bowlby say that children have an instinctive need to be attached to a protective, nurturing caregiver. And neuroscience completely corroborates that. All mammals have that need. And if that need isn't met, it's hell to pay. But the other thing that Bowlby said was that attachment to that specific parent is sacrosanct. The mother, it can't be replaced. That's the part that's wrong.
Interesting. So it seems like what you're saying is that there's almost this gap in psychology, especially around the psychology of emotions. And when you found this sort of in your practice, you realized that there was something deeper that you needed to find, and that led you then to look into the neuroscience side of things.
Well, it wasn't exactly like that. It wasn't as, what can you say? It wasn't as well thought out as that. I just got interested in neuroscience, and I'll be frank with you, I was surprised I could understand it. One thing I think that everybody should know about neuroscience is there's nothing about it that's conceptually difficult. In other words, if I gave you an experiment, you might find some of the terminology a bit difficult, but you could understand it. It wouldn't be if you took a bit of patience and just took your time. The problem with neuroscience is there's a plethora of information, and people use that information and come to different conclusions. And they've come to different conclusions about the creation of affective consciousness. Now, I think I should say at the outset that most neuroscientists, they distinguish between affect and emotion. Emotion is purely physical. In other words, the emotion of fear is the influx of stress chemicals into your bloodstream, pupil dilation, your hair stands on end, you frown, you cringe, stuff like that. All physical manifestations, your heart beats. That's not affect, that's only emotion. Affect is the way you feel. Now you can measure emotion and you can observe it. You cannot directly observe affect. You can only look at the way people behave and think of what they say, and you can infer affect, but you can't directly observe it. So the question is sort of, what is affect? Where does it come from? How does the brain make it? And those are the big questions that I address in the book.
Sure. So to clarify that, you're saying affect is very much in someone's consciousness,
Right.
whereas emotion is maybe more, what's that?
Affect is always conscious.
Is consciousness. So if people have heard the term qualia before, qualia is what you're saying is affect. How does motivation, so you mentioned there's affect, there's emotion. How does motivation fit into all of this? If you were to sort of throw that in as well, is it the case that, are all motivations driven by, some combination of affect and emotion? Is there some motivation which is sort of non-affective motivation? How does that fit into that Venn diagram of those two?
Well, it's sort of the way you define your terms. Now, Jaak Panksepp, he defines all motivation as affective. Now, most of us would say what he calls homeostatic affects, like hunger, thirst, things like that. Most of us would just call them sort of sensations. What he calls sensitive affects, things like if I hurt myself or if I have a nice massage and it feels good, he calls them sensory affects. And most people would just call them sensations. Emotional affects, things like happiness, joy, misery, loneliness, curiosity, and so on. Now, those are the things that most of us call affects. But certainly, what you're really saying is, are we motivated by experiences of pleasure and pain? And as far as we know, we are.
So there's a little bit of a fuzzy boundary there with this question of sensory affect, but at the very least, affective neuroscience can encompass all of this depending on how you define things.
Yeah, I think the way Jaak defines it is unnecessarily confusing, because I've been to a number of lectures and almost everybody says, well, what about sensation? You have to say, well, that's what he means. And why take that extra step?
Sure, that makes sense. So it makes sense that you sort of working in psychology as a professional would get into all of this. Do you think that there's also places where individuals, by learning, by reading your book and understanding more about affect, could also apply this in their lives, either with interacting with other people or understanding their own emotions? How do you see that sort of as a possible benefit from learning this?
Well, I think it's good to know. It's good to know that we have these basic emotions, and there's no getting away from them. You can't get rid of them. But I think one of the important lessons that I learned from it is that emotional systems can be sensitized. For example, you think of PTSD or something like that. Somebody's just had too many scary experiences, and there's been research, and it shows that the fear system, all these emotional systems that Panksepp points out, they consist of structures in the brain, chemicals that fuel them, and they generate stereotypical behaviors, and he would also say affects. So let's say the fear system can be physically sensitized. The new neural pathways are created, let's say, between the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray, which are two very prime structures in the fear system. And when that happens, a person can be will be phobic and maybe afraid of many things, jumpy, anxious, have trouble relating to other people because they feel different. And I think one of the things that psychotherapists should know, and I think everyone should know, is, of course, when somebody has a painful affective experience, sure, you want to figure out what it is, but sometimes trying to dig to the root of it. How do you feel? Or else, let's say sometimes CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, makes people worse. In other words, if you're afraid of something, well, they'll expose you to that thing.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of that'll desensitize you. Sometimes it just makes it worse. So
Sure.
we shouldn't treat our emotions. We should treat our emotions with respect. It's not something you can just play around with and think, well, I can always master it, because that's not always the case.
Sure. So to sort of summarize what you're saying, there's almost these two aspects. As you understand it, you sort of know what you should accept about yourself. You're not trying to get rid of an emotion or saying, oh, fear is bad entirely. Like, that's part of yourself. And so don't sort of fight against it too hard or be too hard on yourself for having that. But then also there are certain ways in which you can, modify the sensitization or the conditioning, and then use that to sort of modify your life. So you know what sort of not to try to change or be hard on yourself for, and you know how you can actually change.
Yeah, well, actually, the way to desensitize fear is to well, you want to keep yourself in a reasonably safe environment. You don't want to start testing yourself in any kind of extreme way, because that can only make things worse. And then you can gradually try in small ways some of the things that worry you, just things that you feel you can manage. Don't go out on a limb.
Sure. So all of that seems very useful as things possibly to learn. So let's dive in now to the sort of the theories overall that you go through in your book of how to sort of think about emotions in these theories. So the first theory you call feedback theory, and this is developed in the late 1800s by William James and Carl Longa. And sort of to quote from your book here, you write that they proposed that each emotion was akin to an automatic reflex with a specific physiological profile that includes visceral responses like changes in blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, and digestion, along with sweating and pupil dilation. According to the James Longa model, a physiological emotional profile of visceral and behavioral change is fed back to the cognitive cortex. And then once we identify the emotional profile, we experience the corresponding affect. So it seems like a pretty plausible model. Are there certain reasons about it that prove it to be insufficient, either from experience in literature, or there are other points about it that upon further investigation, it doesn't seem like the body actually works that way?
No, it doesn't work like that. I point to 4 pieces of research in the book that disprove it. The main one, which I think is the most convincing of all of them, is now if your cognitive cortex created affects, in other words, if all these reactions, emotional reactions, are fed back to your cognitive cortex, and then your cognitive cortex has experiences the affect or creates the affect, you would expect that when you're in a state of high affective arousal, let's say when you're very upset or when you're very happy, that there would be tremendous activity in the cognitive cortex. That's not the case. It's relatively quiescent. On the other hand, if you're in a state of low emotional arousal, like you're doing a crossword puzzle or something like that, a lot of activity in the cognitive cortex. That's the reverse of what you'd expect. So I think that's one very convincing piece of evidence, but there are 3 others as well that I cite in the book.
Sure. That seems very, very convincing to me that, if you're saying this part of the brain is working and it's not working when your theory says so, and obviously in the late 1800s, they couldn't have measured this, so it makes sense they wouldn't have had that evidence at their disposal.
Sure.
In chapter 3, you go into this other theory, sort of to go quickly through things and not getting through all the evidence here. But the conceptual act theory by Lisa Barrett. And in this, you write, sort of to summarize this, the conceptual act theory claims that emotional systems do not exist and that emotions do not emanate from any specific brain region. Instead, affects depend on concepts that we construct largely on the basis of social experience. So it sounds like this is largely saying that, in a sense, emotions are social constructs or cultural constructs. Is that an accurate read on that? And how does the data, again, sort of react to that theory, and how does it interplay with that?
That is a correct read on it. What she says is that when there's a significant stimulus, things happen in your body. You get some sort of body reaction. Most of the time you don't notice it, but if you do notice it, you have no idea what it means. And she uses the example, if your stomach is churning and you're in a bakery shop, you interpret that as hunger. If you're walking around town in flu season, you'll think, oh, I think it's nausea, because you know something about flu symptoms. If you're in a doctor's office awaiting results, you'll think it's anxiety, because you know that sometimes you can get bad news from a doctor. And so her idea is on the basis of social experience, particularly things that people have said to you, language, and then your bodily experience, you put it all together and you construct an emotion. But her idea is if you've never had access to that emotion, suppose you were brought up in a society where there's no anger, you wouldn't know what anger is. It wouldn't play in. And I go through it. She presents a lot of arguments, both anthropological and neuroscientific, and I go through them, and I don't think she's correct.
Sure.
I think her evidence stands up. For example, she says there's a tribe in New Guinea where they don't know the meaning of fear. And none of them, when they have the physiological reactions that you and I do in response to danger, they don't feel frightened because they don't even know what that means, because they have no context to put it in, no concept about it. But I read up on that tribe, and they do have a word for it. Means awe, fear, and respect. And they also conduct rituals where they try to protect themselves against, they have in their religion, dead relatives try to harm them. And they perform these rituals to ward this off. Well, why would you do that if you're not afraid? So I don't think her evidence, but there's a lot of neurological evidences, neuroscientific evidence as well. I don't think it stands up.
Sure. So to get back to this point you're mentioning about these tribes, is the basic point here that if emotions are cultural constructs, then you should see a high degree of variation of emotions across cultures. Sure. And then the question of, if they're constructs, then is, do we actually see this when we look around cultures? Do we see that there are a lot of there's high variation, or do we see largely the same emotions when we actually look in the world?
Well, we see the same, and that's one of the things that, well, that she to be fair to her, she is aware that she's fighting City Hall, and but no, you're right. Anything could be an emotion. Anything could be an affect and an emotion. Anything at all, just depending on the context in which you live and the society in which you live and the use of language and your experiences. Sure, it could be anything.
Sure. Okay, so having sort of introduced those other theories, I wanted to sort of now go to the main theory we have of what you call brainstem theory. That you sort of talk in your sort of chapter 2 and 4 through 7. And it seemed to me that fundamental to the idea of brainstem theory was this idea of basic emotions. And I was wondering if you could sort of expound on what is a basic emotion, and how does that contrast with other models of emotions?
Well, there aren't other models of emotion other than psychological ones. And psychological ones, Freud, for example, and other psychoanalysts since have sort of intuited them on the basis of things that people say and do. So, in other words, Freud saw, well, there's sex and there's aggression. Other people say, well, let's say Bowlby said the need to be attached. Other people say the need for narcissistic reinforcement, in other words, telling you you're good and you're okay. So all these things. But the thing that Jacques did that's different is that he identified real parts of the brain fueled by specific chemicals leading to particular what do you say, particular behaviors. And, you know, he picked these things out. Some of them had already been discovered. He discovered some of them, and he interpreted them. He interpreted them and put them all together in such a way. I mean, it was quite masterful. And he did it just because he's so good at it.
Sure. So this idea that that emotions are tied to specific sort of systems in the brain, as opposed to being a sort of infinite variation,
Yeah.
is that sort of a part of this idea, instead of it being that you could have any possible emotion, or maybe, you know, your culture has, you know, fear, but it's a little bit different, or here's anger, but it's a little bit different, and you have maybe 10 times of anger, 10 times of fear, that there's actually a neurological basis for this. And this is the primary jump of going from a purely psychological view of emotions into the neuroscientific view of emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Lisa Feldman Barrett, you know, the conceptual act theory, she says emotional systems don't exist. And she gives a lot of data that to substantiate that. And as I say, that doesn't hold up. But now Jacques, this taxonomy of 7 basic emotions, it's probably incomplete. There are probably other ones as well.
Sure.
Social dominance and disgust are 2 of the ones that have been mentioned. And also the details of the neurophysiology of all of them, there's probably a lot of surprises in store and a lot more to be discovered. Let's say different levels of aggression or different levels of fear or other things like that. They're probably neurochemically different, and a lot of that, and particularly the play system, there's a lot to be discovered about that. But it's good enough and it's convincing enough for him to propose the existence of these 7 systems, and for us to believe in.
So to sort of now get full into this brainstem theory, so to go through your summarization that you have in the book, you write that brainstem theory maintains that all mammalian brains contain genetically programmed emotional systems located largely in and around the brainstem. It proposes that affects, like emotional systems, emerge largely from deep non-cognitive regions of the brainstem. So people often, when they're talking sort of in popular science, they say that, you know, this region of the brain does this region of the brain does memory, or this region of the brain, you know, does something else. It doesn't sound like you're exactly talking about a single region of the brain for each emotions. It seems like you're saying that there's, you know, a system where there's different parts interplaying. Can you explain that a little bit? Is there like a single anger region? If you take out that part of the brain, then, you know, you're entirely the same, besides that you don't get angry? Or how does it actually work if it's not that?
Yeah, that is how it works. I mean, for example, the amygdala is, I mean, it's a very complex little organism, little part of the brain, but one of the things it does is it allows you to be conditioned, to fear conditioned. So in other words, if you have a mouse or a rat, you give it a shock to the foot, pain unconditionally generates fear. And at the same time, you play an auditory tone. Normally, the auditory tone, the rat would just ignore it. It has no interest in it. On this occasion, however, it becomes afraid of the tone. So after conditioning, you play the tone, the rat will freeze right up. And it will remain that way for the rest of its life. And Joseph Ledoux, in a set of the most elegant experiments, explains exactly how this is achieved. It's entirely involuntary. You don't have a choice about it. But if your amygdala is destroyed, you can't be conditioned. Won't happen.
Sure. So if hypothetically the amygdala was destroyed, you'd imagine that there wouldn't be possibly some fear conditioning, but also then anger would also would not work sort of properly. There probably would be a compound effect where many things would probably not be working. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The amygdala does many things, and it is also involved in rage. But I was just using this example of fear just to show you that, yeah, the amygdala, this little almond-shaped structure in your brain, if it's not there, you cannot be fear conditioned.
Sure. So I think that fear is maybe a really good example. I think it's probably one of the more simple emotions compared to especially something like, you know, like grief or like care or you know, even lust. Could you walk us through an example of how the brainstem theory would say what happens when you're actually getting afraid? Like, is there a certain trigger? What's the response, and how does that all work together?
Yes, there is a trigger, and what happens is there are certain things that we're innately afraid of. For example, human babies exhibit fear when they're not being held in a firm way. Almost all animals are afraid of loud noises. Rats, some of them are species specific. Rats are afraid of well-lit open spaces. You can understand why how that developed from an evolutionary point of view. It's a little animal in a well-lit open space and can be easily predated upon. So you have these innate ones. And what happens is that very quickly, through countless conditioning experiences, they learn to have this whole capacity to fear other things expands exponentially. So imagine there's a rat, for example, that lives in a area near a cat. Now, rats are innately afraid of the smell of a cat. If you raised a rat in captivity and never had been exposed to a cat, you put a pinch of cat fur in its cage, it will become frightened. It'll go off its food, it'll go off sex. It just will not be happy. Now, okay, so this rat is afraid of the cat. Rat living in this neighborhood is afraid of the cat. Let's say the cat wears a bell. It'll be afraid of the bell too. It'll learn to be afraid of the bell. Let's say the cat has some toys. Pretty soon, the rat will learn to be afraid of the toys. Let's say when the owner comes out at night and calls the cat in to come for dinner, the rat might learn to be afraid of the owner's voice. So there'd be any number of things that the rat would be conditioned to fear. And this is how, in this exponential way, through conditioning, we learn to have an emotional response to a wide variety of things.
Does this conditioning response and this conditioning behavior, is that the same across emotions? Would you be able to condition fear
sure.
the same way that you would condition grief? Could you condition care the same way that you condition lust? Or is the conditioning
Probably.
overall, is that a different sort of per emotion?
Probably. They've done the really great sort of specific research has been done on fear by Ledoux. But surely you could do, I mean, think of a lock of hair from somebody you love. What's in a lock of hair? Nothing. Why do you love it so much? Why does it mean so much to you? Why do you put it in a locket, wear it around your neck forever? Why do you keep pictures of people you love? Why do you love the smell of a particular perfume that maybe is your wife's favorite perfume? Why do any of these things happen?
Sure.
But they happen with everything. And I mean, you think of a restaurant that you love, well, because that was, let's say, where you first met your girlfriend or something. And these are important things, of course. This is how and conditioning is the main way that we learn. And I mean, obviously we can learn cognitively as well, but conditioning is the main way that we learn. And what we learn is to have an emotional response to other things that are not innately emotionally important.
Sure. So basically what you're saying is there are these separate emotions that you're pre-inclined to fear certain things or get angry in certain conditions, but that on top of that layer of all these very separate sort of emotions, you can condition into one of the more, and the conditioning layer is more or less the same across the emotions.
I don't quite understand what is the conditioning layer. What do you mean?
So I'm trying to tease out the where are the emotions different and where are they similar. So it sounds like there's this idea that your base sort of unconditioned response is for each basic emotion is quite different. But then when you get into a conditioned response, the way you go from an unconditioned response to a conditioned response is the same across all of the basic emotions.
Well, probably they haven't done enough research to really substantiate that, but it seems very likely. I mean, the way Ledoux parses it out is so impressive. So it must be something like that. But the point is, I mean, each emotion is very different.
Mm-hmm.
And so all these things that you learn that are these associations to different emotions are all very different things. So you have a very different response to to something that arouses tender care than you would to something that arouses anger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this idea of, you know, conditioning, where you can introduce something in a certain situation and then add that link. How does deconditioning work, or extinguishing, or how does it not work? I know there's some work for Ledoux there that shows that it doesn't fully go away, but could you go expound on that?
Well, the only one that's really been, again, researched is deconditioning, let's say, with regard to fear. And what you do, let's say, if you conditioned a rat, let's say in the way that we've just described, conditioned it to fear an auditory tone, the way you decondition it, and it takes much longer. You can condition a rat to fear a tone in just 1 or 2 exposures, and that's it, it's done. In order to decondition, you have to repeatedly expose the rat to the tone with no foot shock accompanying. So you do it over and over and over and over. And after a while, the rat is not afraid of the tone. But if, let's say, you introduce the rat into the cage where it was originally conditioned, or maybe it has exposure to the researcher who conditioned it, or you just give it a foot shock, you know, without any warning, it'll start to fear the tone again. And what that tells you is that the conditioning circuitry remains intact. It hasn't been destroyed. That's not what deconditioning does. It doesn't destroy anything. What it does is it creates competing circuitry, and the competing circuitry will under normal conditions overwhelm the original conditioning circuitry, but it's still there. And that has, you know, tremendous consequences when you talk about psychotherapy, because you don't cure someone in the sense of wiping out what was bothering them. You just show them a different and better way that will help them avoid that.
That's really interesting and pretty deep there on how these emotions are triggered. Going back to this sort of, you know, before the conditioning layer, going to the unconditioned emotions. I know there's a lot of interesting research with Jacques Panksepp, who you co-authored the Archaeology of Mind with. He goes into a lot of interesting experiments where there's almost this causal chain from, you know, here's a behavioral trigger that happens somewhere, there is excitation in the brain, there are neuropeptides that increase in concentration, and then there's sort of a primed action pattern of a response. Could you go through some of that sort of causal chain and talk about how that was able to, you know, be sort of scientifically discovered, or how that was able to be investigated?
Well, some of this is a little beyond my pay grade. The way that Jacques discovered most of this stuff was through electrical stimulation. And what he found, I mean, it's a very well tested way of doing brain research. And what you do is you basically zap a particular part of the brain and see what happens. You see what chemicals, if you can trace the chemicals. I mean, that's what Ledoux did in such this wonderful fashion that I described a little bit. But this is what you do. You zap a particular part of the brain, and then you see what happens. And another thing you can do is they have the ability now to knock out certain neurons, which is to make it impossible for them to function. And they can do that. And if you do that, and then you see what happens. But there's all sorts of, everything that we know about the brain depends on the mechanical ways that we're now able to observe and manipulate it. I mean, if it weren't for that, we just still be looking at this lump of flesh and think, oh, well, there's these different lobes, but I don't know. Sure.
So Jacques could come up with a theory saying, I think that this is how the fear system worked, that there's a trigger and then this part works, and then, you know, here's going to be the behavioral response. And then he could test that by putting the animal in a situation where the fear trigger isn't there, and then you could excite the fear and then see that there's a fear response. And then you could say, okay, now I'm going to numb the part where the fear is, and then put you with a fear trigger, and then there's no response. And so we could entirely control it up or down and show that all the ways in which fear would express is sort of controlled or gated via this one region in the brain, somehow in the causal pathway.
Yeah, that's in principle. I mean, I don't know whether every single bit of that can be achieved, but certainly a lot of it can be. And there are certain parts of a structure in the brainstem, a very important one for emotions, called the periaqueductal gray. And according to Jacques' formulation about the fear system, the certain parts of the periaqueductal gray are the fundamental aspects of fear. Now, if those were knocked out, I don't think you could frighten an animal.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things, for example, that he figured out was the grief system. Now, grief is what you feel when you're socially isolated. And the opposite of that, which is when you are in the company of people whom you love and friends and family, excuse me, that there's an influx of endogenous opioids and oxytocin, and these are feel-good chemicals. These are the comfort chemicals. They make you feel good. And he also noted that people who take drugs of abuse like heroin or morphine and things like this, they take it to feel good. And then he worked out that that endogenous opioids like heroin or morphine, it's a natural addiction that we have towards social relationships. And so he would see the subtleties of this, and you know, he had such insight into it. And this is what made him such a terrific researcher.
It seems like this style of research, where you're going into the brain and figuring out very exactly what the mechanisms, it feels like it's on a whole other level than a lot of the psychological research, where a lot of that sort of introspection oriented, and you think about it, you tell stories, and you think about how you feel, or maybe sometimes we even go to like a folk psychology and say, oh, well, here's what, you know, we used to think about so hundreds of years ago, so let's bring that today. It seems like it's an entirely different level where it's mechanistic and really experimental fundamentally.
Absolutely. I mean, well, just think about it. Think about all the different schools of psychoanalysis. I don't know how many there are now, but lots. Or people who disagree about this aspect or that aspect. Now, why do they disagree? It's because they interpret clinical material differently. When you say, okay, look here, look at this structure here. When you zap it, this happens. None of us are going to argue about that. You can see it with your own eyes. It's not debatable. So the taxonomy of emotions that Jaak has delineated is, first of all, it's much larger than any psychology. It's much more convincing. And this is why it's caught the public imagination to such an extent, because it's a real thing. It's not me just saying, oh, I think you mean such and such. And you might tell me, no, I don't.
So moving on a little bit to this question of animals and emotions and how this is all interacting. So a lot of these experiments that Jaak and Ledoux were doing, a lot of these are done on other mammals that are non-human. And so it seems like one of the fundamental assumptions of this is that humans and these other mammals basically have the same chemistry in their brains for emotions. How similar are sort of mammalian emotional structures and human emotional structures?
There's not too much debate about the emotional. Subcortically, all mammals are pretty much very alike. It's cortically that we're also different.
Sure.
So if let's say you see the way the amygdala operates in a rat, it's pretty much the same in my brain and yours. So, but the trouble is, you see, Jaak actually and Ledoux argued about this a lot, because Ledoux said it's the cortex that creates the affects. Affects being just the feelings, the subjective conscious feelings. He was quite happy to say emotions, which is to say the physiological reactions, that those are created subcortically. But he said it's the cortex that creates the affect. And who has the most elaborate cortex? People, and maybe a few other intelligent animals. But for the most part, other animals, they're not smart enough. They can't make sense of it. So all these things they can't conceptualize it and say, oh, wait a minute, these are all signs of fear, and I understand what fear is because I know all the components of it and so on. They can't do that. And so what he says is, he concedes, Ledoux concedes they might feel something, but because their cortex is so different from ours, it isn't fear. So he doesn't know. So he says they don't. And Jaak says, that's crazy. And Jaak says, look, there's so much evidence. What type of evidence does he have? The evidence is behavioral. I zap the fear system, and an animal looks like he's afraid, so I say he feels afraid. And Ledoux said, how do you know? And Ledoux's right about that. See, even though Jacques says there's all this weight of evidence, and Ledoux says, but all your weight of evidence is based on the assumption that this animal is capable of feeling affects, and you don't know that, and you can't prove it. And Jacques was stumped on that because he couldn't. And so you have to give that one to Ledoux. So that was one of the big reasons why I wrote the book.
Sure. So in your view then,
was to show that affects do emanate from subcortical structures, and since all mammals have those same subcortical structures, all mammals are affective creatures.
So in your view then, so if you imagine you see a dog and the dog looks like it's sad or looks like it's angry or afraid, is it anthropomorphizing to sort of imagine then that the dog is feeling something like anger or fear, or like what is it that's going on there? Is maybe not necessarily having affect, but there's something that seems similar about that experience?
No, I think, and I argued in favor of this view, no, that animal feels the affects. All mammals do. So does, and when you play the tone, the rat feels frightened in the same way that you and I do. So it's not smart as we are, but it has the same basic affective capacities.
I remember there was a chapter in Archaeology of the Mind where you were talking about the seeking behavior and how the seeking behavior in cats is one thing and the seeking behavior in rats is something else, or in mice is something else. It seems like there's, when you excite the seeking circuit, maybe a cat is going to crouch and start to be like a predator, whereas some sort of rodent will actually start foraging behavior. And so there's a sense in which the circuits are there, but they're sort of expressed differently. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Some things are species specific, depending on, for example, and some systems are overdeveloped in certain species. Predatory species that are predated upon usually have more powerful fear systems. They need it. But I would say that take a lion or something like that. A lion in the jungle, a lion in the savannah doesn't have too much to be frightened of. Maybe other lions, but not too much to be frightened of. He's not going to walk around. He's not going to do a lot of crouching. When his seeking system is enervated, it's usually because he's hungry and he's looking for something to eat. Whereas for a mouse is going to be pretty careful where he walks and where he goes. And when he wants something to eat, he'll forage away because that's where his food will probably be. So sure, there's all kinds of variations in terms of different species, but that doesn't tell you anything one way or the other about the basic emotions.
So in your view, how are humans special? You've mentioned that we have this much more developed cortex. We have this much higher cognitive part, which may play a role in sort of the conscious experience of affect. How is it that we're special, or are we just like one of the other animals in your view?
Emotionally, Jacques is only talking about basic emotions. He's not talking about all of psychology. So in terms of basic emotions, basic emotional capacities, no, we're all the same. We're all like cousins. But, human beings, obviously, we have much greater cognitive capacities. We've created cultures, technology, a system of, what can you say? Cognition and culture is what's different about us than other animals. Now, they may have their own kind of cultures that we don't fully understand, but that's what makes us different, and that's what adds to our psychology. So Jacques is not talking about that.
Sure. So how does this understanding of sort of the cousinness of other animals to us, how does that inform how you personally treat animals, or how you think that we should as a society be treating animals?
Yeah, more humanely, obviously, particularly when it comes to killing animals for food. That I don't know if you know of Temple Grandin, but she's done a lot of work with about the humane treatment of animals. For example, if you lead cows to a slaughter and in a straight line, they show extreme anxiety because they don't like to walk that way. They like to walk in circles. if you let them walk in circles and you slaughter them in a way that is painless and humane, then it's much better. And we can all live with that much better when we have our steak dinner. But the way I treat animals, it's no different. I mean, I've always liked animals, at least some of them. So no, it's no different. I think the way that we feel emotionally ourselves, just our own reactions, conform very much to Jacques' hypothesis.
So the natural way we treat animals is almost with empathy, especially if they're mammals, and it seems like we can interpret their expressions.
Yeah.
And you're saying just to sort of go with the flow as far as how your intuition treats it, and that largely will be in line. But that don't go and say, oh, this is a different species, I'm going to ignore it, and intentionally deaden those feelings to be more heartless towards them.
Yeah, sure. I think they've done some studies where we tend to like animals that look a little bit more like us. In other words, we like animals with big eyes, especially like human babies. We like things like that. And this, I remember I bought for my own kids these books about baby animals, and baby animals all have that same born yesterday look on their faces. So cute.
So
we all like it.
How about non-mammals, invertebrates, insects? Do you feel like this says anything about that, or do you think there's almost like a strict-ish divide between the mammals that share a lot of emotions with us, and then insects share basically no emotional hardware with us, and so if we squish one of them, it's fine. You don't worry about that.
Well, I got to admit, if a bug is flying around my head, I definitely want to kill it. But this book I was showing you before, this book by before we went online, David Anderson, The Nature of the Beast. Now he demonstrates that he doesn't talk about affects, he doesn't talk about feelings, but he demonstrates that there are things that very much look like emotions in flies. I found that fascinating, very interesting. His work is terrific. But I think that there's a cutoff point, particularly with reptiles, because reptiles don't have a care system. They don't need one. See, they lay a couple of thousand eggs. So the care system was probably basically evolved to look after helpless young, which is what a lot of mammals have. If we didn't look after our young, they would die. They wouldn't survive at all without us. But if you lay 2,000 eggs and they all run into the sea, I'm thinking of the turtle, and they all run into the sea, and 98% of them are picked off by seagulls, you still maintain your species. So you don't have to look after them in terms of that. And you don't need a care system. And I think animals without a care system they don't really warm my heart. I don't know if they do yours, but.
Sure. So that seems like that's the big emotion for you is this care emotion, which feels like it's largely mammalian specific. And as you go to sort of other vertebrates and
grief as well, all the social systems are mammalian specific, or most of them anyway. I don't think I don't know enough about reptiles to say if they need some social systems. Well, they need lust, they need that, or they wouldn't procreate. But the care system, they definitely don't need.
Sure.
They need fear, they need rage, they need those.
Michael, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the system that I'm most enthralled by is the play system. So could you talk a little bit about the play system? Lucy, go ahead. Could you please?
Am I going to talk about it or me?
No, Lucy. Sorry.
You meant Michael. I thought you meant him. Well, the play system is the one that's least understood physiologically, but Jacques is convinced that it exists for the following reason. He found that rats raised in captivity, not wild rats, but rats raised in captivity, which is to say laboratory rats, have very poorly developed grief systems. So if they're socially isolated, it doesn't bother them as much as it does other animals. And what he found, you see, usually well, I'll carry on. Let me put it this way. Rats begin to play between 17 and 25 days. And so what he did was he isolated a young juvenile rat let's say 15 days to 25 days or something like that, but during the period where they learn or where they begin to play. And his idea was if they play spontaneously, this is a sign that it's instinctive. In other words, they don't learn it. You can't do this with a monkey or even with a cat, because they have grief systems. And usually when a monkey has been isolated for 10 days, once it comes out, it doesn't want to play because it's miserable. And it needs to form social relationships and feel better. And then it'll play. But a laboratory rat doesn't have that problem. So the rat, you put this rat that's been isolated for these 10 days in the company of just one other juvenile rat, it'll immediately jump on its back and begin to play in the very stereotypical way. And on the basis of that, Jaak assumed that the play system is instinctive, and it's one of the systems. But again, the chemistry of it and the neurophysiology of it is still quite hazy.
So it almost seems like there's something of a priority of these basic emotions where if you think something is going to kill you, you're definitely going to feel fear. If you haven't been around people for a while, you're going to feel grief. And then maybe if everything else is okay, then maybe you can play. And so there's something where it's almost confounding the study of play because it's so low on the emotional totem pole that if you are, if anything else is wrong, you might not be playing, and therefore that could interrupt sort of your study because it is sort of low priority. Is that the right way to think of it about it?
Yeah, because they found out, for example, that let's say they didn't know this. Before they knew that rats were inherently afraid of the smell of cat hair, they would try to do experiments with rats. But let's say somebody came in who had a cat at home and had just been petting the cat. Well, the minute it interacted with the rat was scared. So that contaminated all other experiments. So yeah, it's true.
So you get into your book this idea, especially from Damaiso, and I'll read a little quote here about homeostasis and the relationship between homeostasis and emotions. And so to quote you, you write that Damaiso maintains that when homeostasis is balanced or optimal, we feel good. And when it is imbalanced, we feel bad. Panksepp, on the other hand, maintains that the creation of affects is independent of homeostasis. Can you explain this idea of homeostasis as it relates to emotions, and then how do you think that a homeostasis is related to affect and emotions?
Well, the first one, yes, I can do that. The second one is, I don't know. Nobody does, I don't think. Now, Damaiso has the idea that there's a part of the brain which he calls the protoself, and then he describes what he thinks might be brainstem structures that might be part of the protoself. And the protoself monitors homeostasis. And when we talk about homeostasis, we're not talking metaphorically, we're talking about the amount of calcium in your body, we're talking about circadian rhythms, we're talking about your body temperature, things like that. And the way it works is that all these homeostatic factors have to be within narrow range. In other words, if my temperature fell or rose 5 degrees, I'd be in trouble. So this is, by staying within these tight parameters, the animal stays alive. And this is called the internal milieu, or homeostasis. But it's a physical thing. And what he's saying is the state of your homeostasis is your protoself. The protoself structures in your brain monitor this, and the protoself has the capacity. He has a kind of complicated mechanism. I'm not going to go into it. But the protoself has the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. It can be physical pleasure and pain, and it can be affective pleasure and pain. So this is the very tight link between affect and homeostasis that Damaiso has created in his hypothesis. He also says that everything that we do is an effort to maintain homeostasis. In other words, to feel good. So everything I do is just to feel as good as I possibly can. And that, because that maintains homeostasis and that keeps me alive. So if I eat a nutritious meal, I feel good. I like it. Makes me feel good. And I take him to task on that because it isn't true. To take maternal behavior, the care system, it's characterized by the influx of oxytocin, endogenous opioids, feel-good chemicals. It's a tremendously positive experience. A mother animal will put her life at risk. She'll try to, let's say, detract the attentions of a predator to herself in order to protect her brood. So she's acting in a very anti-homeostatic way. So he's wrong about that. So then the question is, how much does what role does homeostasis play in the creation of emotions? Now we know from certain experiments that it doesn't. For example, the seeking system is characterized by the secretion of dopamine, a real energized feel-good chemical. It gives you a tremendous power of individual agency. It makes you want to do things. It intense curiosity and interest and enthusiasm that sometimes borders on euphoria. And the reason people become addicted to cocaine and methamphetamines is because it activates dopamine and innervates this system. And that's why it's so addictive. Now, they found out that the seeking system, although it's very rewarding, is typically activated. The seeking system, this dopamine system, is activated when animals are hungry or thirsty, which is to say when they're in a state of homeostatic somewhat imbalance. How can that be? How can that be? It can't be. So in that case, homeostasis doesn't, homeostatic imbalance is creating a positive emotion, which contradicts everything that Damaiso says. Now, does it usually contribute to the creation of emotion? Maybe, I don't know. Jaak has a different hypothesis entirely. What he says is that a particular stimulus will arouse a particular emotional system, and that emotional system has a signature. That emotional system creates synchronous firing of neurons in that system. And that synchronous firing will have a particular signature. For example, in the rage system, it might be a pounding, sort of insistent sort of thing. And he's saying that will resonate in affective structures, also subcortical, and that will create literally an affect which is very similar to this signature code. And so, in other words, if my rage system is, according to Panksepp, my rage system is activated and I get this pounding rhythm and it resonates in affective things, that makes me want to do something, it makes me want to strike out, and I will replicate it in my behavior. Similarly, if it's the care system, it'll be very gentle, it'll be soothing, and maybe I'll sing a lullaby or something like that. But all this takes place in the brain, and it doesn't reflect homeostasis. But I should say that both hypotheses have their problems, which I outline in the book.
It seems like there's a very loose view of homeostasis that almost is identical to the idea of sort of evolutionary psychology or just evolution in general, where in some sense, in order to sort of propagate a species, you have to exist long enough in order to survive long enough in order to propagate. And so if you include homeostasis and say, oh, well, it's the evolutionary homeostasis of what I need to survive in order to propagate, and then you can sort of include the emotion of lust into this like homeostasis, but then it almost becomes a non-individual homeostasis. Do you think there's something about that, or is homeostasis just a more concentrated version of that evolutionary view on things?
Homeostasis is very specific, and it has to do with the survival of the individual. And that was one of the things that Jaak pointed out that sort of was very elucidating. He said the lust system, he said, it's pretty insistent, it's pretty powerful. What does it do for your individual survival? Nothing at all. Think of the popes. They live a long time. They look pretty healthy to me. Yeah, maybe they're missing out a lot in life, but who knows? It doesn't have anything to do with homeostasis. In other words, He said lust has to do with propagation of the species. That has nothing to do with homeostasis. And certain other ones also have to do with the species, you know, survival of the species. The care system, for example. If you didn't have the care system, and mothers weren't, or it's not limited to mothers, please, that would be very unfair. But if a mother, or let's say a firefighter or a police officer or a healthcare worker weren't prepared to risk themselves to help well, we wouldn't survive.
So
but particularly with the young.
Does it seem like there's almost a different level of like, how broad is the circle of concern associated with each emotion? Like fear, it seems like if you don't respond to fear, then you might die. Rage is some sort of, if I wanted to get something and therefore I'm frustrated, or something is hitting me, I need to defensively aggress against it. It feels like there's maybe a little bit broader of, it's not just me right now, but maybe what my plans. Seeking maybe is for food, but then beyond that, you get things like lust, where it almost is, here's my, my lineage of some sort. Grief almost seems like it's related to the idea of my social circle. Care obviously also then extends to social circle. Is there a sense in which there's like a different circle of concern, and you can have some emotions that have broader circles of concern and others that are much more localized?
Absolutely. Some of them are concerned with homeostasis, survival of the individual, fear, rage, probably, although probably not exclusively, but more so like that. But you have the care system, you have the seeking system, you have things like that. They're much more concerned with survival of the species.
I think it's very common nowadays for people to say that
lust is the quintessential one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's it. Without it, nothing would happen.
I think it's very common for people to say nowadays that humans are inherently selfish, and all motivation is selfish, and when you're doing something, it's just because you feel good. How do you interpret that within this? It almost seems like there's some level which you're saying, well, you feel good when you feel the emotion of care or when you act on it, possibly, but you also were I think at one point talked about anger, and anger is not necessarily feeling good. So maybe it's not necessarily that you act because you feel good. How do you have this, answering the question of, are humans inherently selfish? Is our motivation inherently selfish? How do you think about that?
I don't think it is, because we have these, some of the basic emotions of care, for example, and the seeking system. It's funny, I talked about the Wright brothers briefly in the book. I always liked their story, because they made 400 attempts at flight before they were successful. Can you imagine trying to get a government grant to do that? And when you failed 399 times. So, but they had this drive in them, and they kept going, and they kept going, and they kept going until they succeeded. And this is important for mankind. This is important for all of us. It's important for progress. Mm-hmm. And for moving ahead. So the seeking system isn't just looking for food, although it's probably mainly for that most of the time. But it's more than that. It makes you want to try something, makes you want to take a risk. So important in life to have the ability and the wish to take a risk, a decent one. But they've studied rats. They've even studied decorticate rats whose decortex has been surgically removed. They display normal self-sacrificing maternal behaviors. They do. So no, selfishness isn't everything.
So I feel like that's most of my questions. I want to just sort of wrap things up here. I'm wondering if there are any tangible ways in which you feel like you've behaved differently from before you learned a lot about this affective neuroscience, and then after. Are there things that you feel like you've changed in your own life that are sort of more tangible, or is it just that general more appreciation for how emotions function, or what has been your takeaways and your changes in life, sort of non-professionally?
Well, in the last chapter, I talk about, as a psychotherapist, I talk about two cases which I handled quite differently than I would have done otherwise, than I would have done according to the way that I was trained, and they both worked well because of that. And one was a boy who was, kind of a deadbeat teen. You know, he didn't do anything right, didn't study, didn't show up to meet his friends. He was a member of a band. He never practiced. He was just a pain. And anytime people were irritated with him, which everybody was, he would, you know, oh, nobody's nice to me. Why don't people appreciate what a sensitive, wonderful person I am, and so on and so forth. And he was deeply depressed. And the background of it was he had a father who didn't give a damn about him, who showed no interest in him ever, and a mother who kind of, you couldn't say she didn't love him, but she did love him, but he was kind of her best friend. So he didn't have anybody to encourage him and help him along. And anyway, he was the kind of kid, you know, girls weren't interested in him. He had a terrible posture, miserable facial expression. He was always sort of scowling. Anyway, he got into trouble with his friends about something which I describe in the book. And he said to his friends said that he was a nagging little bitch, a real pain in the ass. And and he came into the office, came in to see me, and he was miserable. And he said, oh, this has happened. Now I can't be friends with any of them. Nobody stood up for me. And I said, well, look, you're not stupid. You understand how other people feel. He had put this other kid on the spot, blaming him for something, which was kind of his fault, but you know, he should have let it go. And I said, look, you were after this guy. Why didn't you see this coming? And he saw it. You know, now he wouldn't have seen it. He and I had always had a good relationship. I always liked him, and so he took it when I said it. And I noticed a change in him within the next week when I saw him, standing up straight, much more resolute expression. And within a couple of months, he met a girl, fell in love with her. She fell in love with him. But everything changed. Now, I didn't sort of talk about, at that point, I didn't talk about the fact that, oh, what he would do is he would replicate everything into the relationship with his father. In other words, you don't give a damn about me. I'm going to be a pain in the neck. I'm going to disappoint you, and then I'm going to blame you. So he did this with everybody. I didn't repeat that at all. I said, look what the trouble is. And what was the trouble? He was afraid. He was afraid of failing. I said, you have to man up. And then now you can't leave it there and say, look, you screwed up. And he said, well, what do I do? I said, well, go to your, you know, we're not supposed to give advice. But I did. I said, just apologize. You could tell him the truth. Tell him you heard that he was complaining about you. And that said, when I thought about it, I thought you were right. I've been a pain in the neck. And he did that. All his friendship, the kid took his apology. All his friendships improved. Everything was better. He even cleaned up his room, which was a bone of contention between him and his mother. Now, the other case was a little boy who'd had a rather traumatic circumcision. Not that the surgery went wrong, but there was a prelude to it where there was had a tight foreskin. There was lots of manipulation of it, trying to manipulate it and make it better. Anyway, it didn't work. It was very upsetting to him, painful, and so on. Now, this happened when he was 3 or 4 years old, and he didn't really remember much of it at all. But obviously, his fear system had become very sensitized. It wasn't apparent when he was a little boy because, you know, he was a nice little boy and his parents were nice people, played controlled sort of nice games, everything under parental supervision. When he got to be 8 or 9, that's when boys become a little rougher and they become a little bit more rebellious and they talk about things. And there was one kid in his class particularly whom he was scared of, a kind of a rough boy. But he was afraid of everything. And you know, he was good at sports, but he dropped out because he was afraid he was going to be hurt. Now, ordinarily, I was taught about the Oedipus complex and so on, and the Oedipus complex is real. I mean, I'm not trying to deny it, but I would have normally said, something like, well, did you feel you were being punished, or that somebody was trying to hurt your penis because maybe you felt it was bad, or something like that? I would have said something along those lines. Didn't say a word about that because I knew about sensitization. I said, you know, if you're scared, something must have scared you. Something must have really scared you. And then I told him an example about somebody who got mugged, and she was scared. I said, well, of course, she was a grown-up when it happened. So she remembered, she knew why she was scared. You might have forgotten, but I think from what Mommy told me, it was when you were a very little boy. Because you must have thought, why are grown-ups doing this? Grown-ups aren't supposed to hurt other people. And you must have thought the world had gone crazy. And up until then, he had thought, he had no idea why he was so scared. And he thought everybody was saying, for goodness sakes, don't be so scared. And when they would talk him down, he would believe it. But then it would rise up again, and he was kind of drowning in fear. So that was very important for, you know, him to know that somebody understood how it happened and that it was real. And then with that in the background, his parents, then they understood too. And with that in the background, they could introduce him to things in a very gentle way. And he built, and within the course of the summer, he was fine. And he was, I phoned him a year later, and he was fine a year later. So in that way, it completely informed my work.
Well, thank you very much. That's the end of my questions. Is there anything else that you want to talk about from the book, or any other points you want to make? And if not, I know we talked before about maybe taking a quick little break, and this might be a good time to do that before we get into more questions.
Okay, we could take a quick break.
Okay.
Maybe
Okay, great.
minutes, okay?
Yes, sounds
Okay.
good. So, folks, we're going to take a couple of minutes break. So, Lucy, whenever you're back, please take your time.
Okay, it'll just be 2 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. All right, see ya.
See you. Michael, that was a great interview. You just covered the entire book amazingly well, and got to talk a lot about Jack Panksepp, which, you know, whose work interests me to no end. So great, and Lucy is so amazing at answering all the questions. You know, she's very quick in kind of saying, oh, you know what, that's exactly what's wrong with that theory. And that's so what did you think?
Yeah, I really enjoyed getting to interview her about this book, and for everyone else in the chat, I just posted a link to the book if you're interested in it. It's this one right here, a shortcut to Understanding Affective Neuroscience. And yeah, I think it's really interesting to compare the theories. I feel like I dove into affective neuroscience reading through Jacques Panksepp's work, and really just, you know, seeing that as the one way of doing things. And then I've later on discovered the other views, and I think I'm still very much loyal to Jacques' views, but it is nice to have this rounded out discussion of what are the other views, what are their models, why do they think they work, and also why do they not work. So I think that it definitely adds a lot to the overall conversation to be able to have this comparison of the models. So I definitely really appreciated the book in that regard.
Wonderful, thank you, folks. So now we go to the Q&A period. Try to keep your questions concise so that we can get through as many questions as we can. We're going to start with Rupali, Paul, Ella, and Zerar. Rupali, go ahead.
Well, Lucy and Michael, thank you very much for that informative conversation. I have two questions. One is about the amygdala and its development in adolescents. How does it affect their development, and what should adults know about teenagers and their emotional development at that time? The second is about moral development in humans and neuroscience, the relationship between that, and what should educators know about how children develop their understanding of what's right, wrong, and how can they have a positive conditioning in the classroom. Thank you.
So Lucy, please take your time to answer the questions. You can keep your answers as short or as long as you want.
The first part of the question was about adolescence. Well, there's two things that happen in adolescence, and one is the burgeoning of the hormones and the development of the body, of the adult body. which is a big adjustment. And the second thing to remember about adolescents is that their prefrontal cortex is not very well developed, or not fully developed. It doesn't fully develop until about the age of 25. So that means that there's a lot of changes going on, and in general, the cortex inhibits emotional aspects of the brain, and the emotional aspects innervate the cortex. So let's say if you're scared, you'll have scary thoughts. But sometimes if you're scared, you can talk yourself down. You say, look, wait a minute, there's nothing to be scared of. But so what you have is you have very burgeoning emotions and a somewhat limited ability to control them in adolescence, which is why it's a very volatile time. And I think that's something to just always bear in mind when dealing with adolescence. And the second question I had to do with moral development. I'm not sure if I can quite. I'm
Sure. Rupali, can you repeat the question, please?
the second part.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that. I was thinking that, how does neuroscience affect, the understanding in children about what's right, what's wrong? You mentioned that for rats, they can understand their emotions at 17 months. I could be wrong. What is the age for children where developmentally they understand how to fit in within a society? And what can educators do to facilitate that conditioning in the classroom so that children can, it's not just about academics, but about social behavior in the community?
Yeah, I think it's a very gradual process. It's done over a period of time. But I think that one of the things that I emphasized in the book is we've put a lot of emphasis upon caring about other people, and that's extremely important, and about making positive relationships also couldn't be more important, the care system and the grief system. But also equally responsible, equally important, which I don't think is being emphasized enough, is the need to take on responsibility. In other words, the activation of the seeking system. In other words, personal agency, preparedness to say, no, I'm going to take this on myself, on my own, and this is up to me. So I think that responsibility is probably the main thing that is not being emphasized as much as it should be.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Next up is going to be Paul, Ella, Zerar, Mike, Sophia, and Jyoti. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I feel like I need to listen to that about 100 times over to get everything that you said. So a huge amount of coverage. So I'm asking questions as a therapist with involvement in neurofeedback. So I'll try to be very concise. And the current trends you talked about. So taking into account, one thing I'd hope you mention in some manner is mirror neurons and how you think of them related to all this. Secondly, therapies in the current trends that focus on the body. So you get to the sensation and you ignore all cognitive analysis or thinking. The therapy says you just become aware of the sensation and then you dissolve it with imagery or something like that, and try to disarm it without anything but focusing on the sensation. And then how do you see the things you've discovered relating to what we should be doing with neurofeedback, which for instance might be attempting to influence the communication between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex? So mirror neurons, body keeps the score type therapies, neurofeedback. What do you say we should do, Lucy? There's my questions.
Good question. Okay. Well, mirror neurons, just as far as we know, they allow us to, it leads to the impulse to imitate. In other words, what they found out is that with a monkey, when a monkey observed another monkey moving its hand, the neurons in the observing monkey's brain that make it move its hand are active. So there's some sort of imitation thing that's going on. Now, the body keeps the score. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the heck that's about. As I say, my reservations about homeostasis, I just don't understand. Does it mean that obviously the brain controls everything in the body, and there's a tremendous amount of feedback? So to that extent, sure, the body is very important. If you're sick or something like that, it will be important in the way that you feel. As far as doing things that would strengthen the neural pathways between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, I have no idea how that's achieved. Maybe somebody could find out a way, but as far as I know, one of the things that needs to happen in therapy is there needs to be the capacity, at least in the short run, to inhibit emotion so that you can consider it and think about it. Otherwise, people just act out. And we know, when you have a client who's just acting out all the time, fighting with his boss or smoking weed all the time, you say, you need to do something about that before I can help you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy.
I don't think that's much of an answer, to be honest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Put in the chat something about
Next up is going to be, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Lucy. Next up is going to be Ella, Gerard, Mike, Sophia, and Jyoti. Folks, keep your questions short so we can get to as many as possible. Ella, go ahead.
Yes, that was a sort of a great lead in that Paul had. And thank you so much, Lucy and Michael, for your wonderful presentation. I'm going to sort of take that whole idea that Paul just mentioned to another level of families in trauma, such as in impoverished situations or stuck in a societal system that keeps them sort of interacting and feeding off one another, and the anxiety being passed around and the trauma, and yet depending on one another. And so family systems therapy is separated from the individual therapy. And thank you for discussing the body keeps the score, because I also have my reservations on that working with trauma. But yeah, so in terms of the family system and trauma that is generationally a factor, what would be anything that would tie it to the research, the neuro cognitive research and the amygdala systems that might be helpful? Thank you.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that you can't separate, particularly with children, you can't separate their emotional problems from their problems of their parents or the environment in which they live. And to some extent, that can be said of all of us. One of the things that Freudian psychoanalysis or classical psychoanalysis maintains is that there's an inner concept and an inner idea about the world, and that you're responding on the basis of that. And there's a lot of truth to that, in the sense that suppose you were brought up by a very vindictive, authoritarian parent, you will develop the idea that this is what authority is like, and you will see it everywhere, even when it isn't there, even when it's not there at all. So to some extent, that needs to be taken, unpacked in psychotherapy. But the other thing is, particularly with a child, if you're living in a situation where everybody is impacting on you in a particular way and you're helpless and you can't get away from it, it's just like, I don't know if you've ever had a job where you had just a horrible boss. I did once, and it was just a rotten experience. I mean, I actually hated my job for a while because of this awful person. Now, fortunately, it only happened once to me, but this is the sort of thing. Now, always the question is, when you have something enmeshed like that, how amenable are people to change? And I think this is where probably in the future psychiatry, which is to say medications will take on a much greater role. We don't have the medications at the moment, but can you imagine if you had a medication that addressed rage, persistent rage with certain parents, how much better that would make things, or something that would induce care in certain mothers? But we don't have that now. What I find is that when I have parents who are, pathogenic, I think it's divided into thirds. 1/3 of them tells me to go to hell, and sometimes takes out, when I worked for the National Health Service in England, sometimes took out a complaint against me. Very unpleasant experience. The other third would say, oh, you've been great, thanks a lot. No, I will put all that into action. No more, no thank you. And, in other words, a kiss off. And the other third, there would be an initial bad reaction. They go, no, that's not true. What are you talking about? And then maybe they'd start to cry a little bit. One guy went home, got drunk. There was another mother who took to her bed for a couple of days, but then the penny drops, something happens. Now, why does it happen with some and not others? I wish I knew. But when they change their behavior, everything comes right in almost no time. So how you deal with these very enmeshed situations, well, this is the big stumbling block in all our work.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Zerar, followed by Mike. Zerar, I know you're new. What's your question?
Hi, I had 2 questions. They're maybe a little more specific. I think one of them was on, so I know Lisa Feldman-Barrett's work that you were talking about being socially constructed, but I also know I think she also talks about these 2 dimensions that seem to be basic to how she conceptualizes a thing, like affect and valence, as being a kind of, more basic. So I was just curious how that relates to the other stuff you had talked about. And then the second question was, I forgot where I had heard about this, but I think it was some researcher in the UK, and I'm forgetting his name, but he talks also about in humans, some processes that are related to emotions get reorganized. So that in animals like rats, they might be in the amygdala, but then in humans, they're no longer seem to be associated with the amygdala, but they're associated with the OFC. I was just curious about how that, like, if that kind of reorganization does occur between animals and humans, and how that might relate to the generalizability of the basic emotions.
Okay, the first,
Thanks.
as far as Feldman-Barrett, she talks about valence, which generally means intensity, and pleasure and pain. In other words, is it good or bad, and how good or bad is it? But her point is that we don't know what it is. We can't identify it in any way unless we have a concept that helps us to do so. So that's what she says about that. And the second one, remind me again about the OFC. Yeah, well, rats don't really, that's the orbitofrontal cortex. It's part of the prefrontal cortex, and it develops in the course of life in human beings. And it's very important because it allows you to reevaluate and change your mind, as it were. In other words, the amygdala, when there's a frightening, I think I'm getting this right, when there's a frightening stimulus, it's very, and let's say it stops being frightening, it's very difficult for the amygdala to regard that stimulus as no longer threatening. It will persist in its reaction to it. The orbitofrontal cortex has much greater flexibility. Now, rats and rodents and lower animals, they don't really have much of an orbitofrontal cortex. If they have one, it's not highly functional. I don't know if they have one, or I can't remember that stuff. but it's much more important in human beings, and it exerts a much more inhibition on lower structures. So it's very much more important. So if a rat becomes frightened, I mean, it's just frightened. You have to decondition it for a long time in order to calm it down. With a person, you could say, look, this thing is scary, but if you stay over here and stay away from it, it won't hurt you. And then they're all right.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Next up is going to be, give me just a second here, is going to be Mike. Mike, what's your question?
What I distilled out of your excellent talk with and dialogue with Michael T. and some of the others here, that a major thrust, the discriminator is survival, and exceptions to that initially are none, and they're learned later. And as evidence thereof, when you open up a rat or a human baby, the brain is perfectly white, and it becomes gray when the connections are formed. Now, how do you discriminate what the different causes and relative weights are between the amygdala and you didn't mention it, only in passing, the hippocampus and chemistry, rather than the cerebral cortex. How do you say, what are the relative weights of each of these? Did you do design experiments to separate these things and to decide where these things were stored, how they were stored, and what effects are simply chemistry, what effects are instinctual, what extents are just that everything is verboten until it isn't.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
I'm not sure I know how to answer this question. I mean, the emotions are instinctive; they're not acquired, and they're generated subcortically. So that's there. Now, how developed are they at birth? Not all that well developed, some of them, and so exactly the development of them, I haven't really studied that, so I'm not really qualified to speak about it to any great extent. But I'm not sure I understood the second part of the.
What he was asking is what is the relationship between amygdala, hippocampus, and the cerebral cortex in?
Well, the amygdala generates or is involved in the generation of a number of emotions, both positive and negative. Negative is most prominently fear, rage. It's also involved in positive emotions as well, in positive sensations and so on. But the amygdala has gotten the reputation, probably because of Ledoux, because the amygdala is so important in conditioning experiments. It's gotten the reputation of being the hub of emotionality, which it isn't. It's very important, but it's not the hub. The hub is probably the periaqueductal gray in the brainstem. The periaqueductal gray is shaped in a column form, and the 7 columns in the periaqueductal gray correspond to the 7 columns that the 7 systems that Jacques discovered. So if you're looking for a hub, that would probably be it. The hippocampus is extremely important, not so much in the generation of emotion, but the hippocampus is responsible for a number of extremely important things. One is the creation of personal memories. In other words, not memories like who's the president of the United States, but what did your mother give you for Christmas? Not memories like 4 and 4 is 8, but memories of where were you when your wife accepted your proposal for marriage? Things like that, things that are personal. And the hippocampus, it begins to function at about 2 years, but the prefrontal cortex, which makes memories, is too undeveloped to make any memories to remember. So in general, it does, you don't start to get personal memories until about the age of 4, and even then they're pretty rudimentary. So, and the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that does the thinking and perceiving, and but it's responsible for all our cognitive capacities, which is, I mean, huge. Couldn't be more important.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Next up is going to be Sophia, Jyoti, and Niru. Sophia, go ahead.
Hi, and thanks very much for your wonderful talk. My question is that how we can, let's say, overcome the conditioned fear that, I don't know, you were talking about amygdala or other sources like the 7 columns you were just talking. So regardless of the origin, what is the best way to overcome the conditioned fear, in addition to like normal, like behavioral therapy, like exposing? Thank you.
Well, it depends on the kind, there's different kinds of fear. For example, we know that benzodiazepines help overcome fear of something bad happening, but they won't have very much. There's another kind of fear, which is that gnawing anxiety when you feel lonely or when you feel unsupported, and that is quite different. So it's important to know which kind of fear are you talking about. You can think of it this way. If you're afraid that, if a kid is afraid of getting an injection at the doctor's office, that's fear. If they're lost in a train station, that's grief fear. That's an exacerbation of the grief system. In other words, oh my God, I'm all by myself. There's nobody to take care of me. That's a very different kind of fear. It's a terror, but it's very different. It's assuaged by different medications in animals, and it produces very different feelings. If a child is really afraid of something bad happening or an animal, it'll crouch. It won't say anything. When an animal is lost, it'll cry and wail out, basically trying to be rescued by its parents. And I don't know if you've ever heard the cry of a lost child, but it's quite distinctive,
Yeah,
So
I have to tell you, Lucy, you're from New York, so you'll appreciate that. People think of New Yorkers as being uncaring. I want to relate to you this one incident. This was right next to the Empire State Building. And there was a mother and a child. The child was only about 3 years old. They were walking together. And the mother stopped at a window in order to look at the window of the shop. And the child walked few steps forward, about 15. The whole place was crowded with lots of people rushing around. And the child turned around and didn't see her mother. And she cried out. And I tell you, everybody stopped. And everybody turned in a protective way towards the child for just a second, because the mother was right there. She immediately ran, she called out and ran, and everybody went off on their own. That I wanted to just tell you about that.
Yeah, well, you see, these sorts of things, they get through to us because of these basic emotions. We can sense it also in animals sometimes, and it gets you. It gets you every time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Jyoti, followed by Niru. Jyoti, and then we will do some concluding remarks, and then we will wrap it up. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like amygdala is a very popular theme here in this discussion. I have a probably more or less on the same lines, except with a slight twist, the language. A child has been traumatized before the development of the language, and he or she is very confused. And then what happens to that emotion? That is maybe, I think for all this time, I thought amygdala was the hub where the emotions get generated, but it doesn't matter where the generation took place. Now, what happens to that emotion or the trauma, the pain that he encountered when he could not even express himself? And then does it, I know psychotherapy is a way to go, but does it stay with the child for the rest of the adulthood? Or is there like a break in that cycle with the witch hunt or what? How do you get to that child then
Well,
with the pain?
I remember you from last time. Weren't you last time I was on this
I probably would, because I like neuroscience.
Yeah, I think I remember you. Yeah, I think we were on the same sort of closed, the small panel. Anyway, sorry, get back to your question. Yes, what happens is that the fear system itself becomes sensitized. In other words, there's what the studies have shown is there's more neural connections between the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray, this part, which I think is the hub. And there's more neural connections even within the amygdala itself. In other words, the whole thing is more sensitized. And this means that when anything frightening or scary happens, there's an overreaction to it. So what happens is that even though the child may not even remember, it might happen before they were even able to remember, much less name what happened to them. They're left with this condition. And so what they're saying is, I'm scared of this, I'm scared of this, I'm scared of this, I'm scared of this. And you can say to them, now, one of the things that they feel is that they're a little bit crazy, because everybody says there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing, you're afraid of nothing. And they realize, if they listen to the parents or the teachers and they say, no, there's nothing to be afraid of. I realize you're right. Now I'm still scared. What the hell is the matter with me? So if you tell them there's nothing to be scared of,
looks like there is an internet problem. Give me just a second. Hold on. All right. I think Lucy will be back. While Lucy, we figure out what's going on with the internet. Michael, I want to ask you a question. Most of the people here are not familiar with Jack Panksepp's work. Could you speak for maybe 2 to 3 minutes about why people should be reading Jaak Panksepp and what is the best way of reading him?
Sure. So there's, we got a little bit into this as we were talking through the methodology. There are a lot of theories you can have about the nature of emotions, sort of going from introspection or looking at folk psychology and trying to bring that forward, or coming from some other fields. As far as I know, Jaak Panksepp and people that are in this area, like Ledoux as well, do the best job of actually looking at the science and being able to experimentally determine, is this theory correct or not? A lot of other theories, they can be internally consistent, but don't necessarily map into reality nearly as neatly. I would not be surprised if moving forward, we'll find that a lot of the new theories are going to be based in this work, and based in this sort of more scientific style of neuroscience, and based much less in a lot of the more sort of theoretical abstract ideas that are not as grounded in sort of the real science of things. It seems like it's a much stronger constraint on theories going forward. It also sort of makes the space a lot more mechanistic to understand what's going on. So instead of it being, oh, it's, to me, anger feels like this, someone else, anger feels like this, you can have a much deeper understanding of exactly what are all the possible ranges that anger can be expressed in, how can it be triggered, how can it express, and the same for all the other emotions. So it seems much cleaner, much more precise, and then much more solid ultimately as a foundation for emotional research.
Good.
Hi.
What's going on?
Okay, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah.
So I will go ahead and
you carry on, and I'll get you through the phone. I'm sorry, this was my fault.
No, don't worry, Lucy. Don't worry. I'm able
sorry.
to get you through the phone.
Okay.
I can hear you. So give me just a second. Hold on. Okay. So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Can you go ahead and answer Jyoti's question?
Sure.
What
About the
happens-
fear, about the fear. So
Yes.
once you say to them, look, you're afraid for a reason, something frightened you, and that's the reason you're scared of so many things now, is because it's left you jumpy. And then you say, once they feel that, then they feel a bit more grounded, and they don't think they're crazy. And then you can say, well, let's try and overcome that fear. And then you basically do extinction experiments with them, extinction, experiences with them. And you say, try this. Maybe, if you're afraid to go on a climbing frame, why don't you just go on a very low frame when mommy and daddy are right there to help you, and just so you see what it feels like, see what the footing is like. Or if you're afraid to go underwater, say, why don't you go into a swimming pool, hold mommy or daddy's hands and put your face in the water for a second, just for a second, just to see what it feels like. And that's the way this little boy I describe in the back of in the end of the book, that's how he was cured.
Wonderful. So let me go ahead and ask a couple more questions. Just a second here. Hold on.
I'm so sorry, everyone.
Oh, no problem. No problem at all. So Lucy, so firstly, what is it? I know that you worked very hard over a long period of time. It was a promise you had made that you would get the book out. What does it feel like finally having this book out?
Well, it's that combination, when when you're working toward a goal, it just seemed sometimes it would never end. Every time I got to what I thought was the end, I saw, oh, gee, I have this area that I need to research. And when you do neuroscience research, sometimes you go down a hole and it lasts about 2 weeks before you come up the other side. So that was rough. So, but at the same time, I was a little depressed because I had been working toward a goal and it had been so nice and I had enjoyed that. I always had something to think about. And although I felt satisfaction once I got it done, don't get me wrong, I missed working toward it.
Wow. So the next question is that in terms of applications, because this is a very radical idea of saying, look, let us use all the research that we have on neuroscience and actually apply it instead of some theories that people have just made up. Base everything that you're trying to do in application on this. What do you expect, like looking forward, 10 years from now, what would you expect to be the result of it? What would you like to see happen?
I'd like to see particularly psychiatrists to have a better understanding of affective neuroscience, because in my experience, they don't have practically any. They don't know, what they know about is clinical trials. In other words, you try this medication and maybe it does this. And so, but what it does to the brain is entirely missing. So I'm hoping that it will bit by bit revolutionize psychiatry and turn psychiatry from a not terribly interesting line of work at the moment to one that's fascinating and wonderful. But I think that it has, people's minds have opened up. For example, when I first was working on this case with the little girl who went back to her biological parents, I can't tell you how much opposition there was to they did not believe she was doing well. They just didn't. It's very simple, because it was so ingrained in them that you can't do this. And there was almost, almost a disappointment that she was doing so well because they had been so passionately on the other side of the issue. Well, it's like when you find out, that it's not very nice when you find out you've been really wrong, especially when you felt so passionately about it. It's been such a moral thing. Whereas now I find when I talk to people about it, they're much more accepting. Even classical psychoanalysts, much more accepting of it.
Wonderful. Last question. What did you think of Michael's interview of you and the conversations and the questions
Oh,
after?
I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. It was fun to talk about these things. There was one sort of area where I had sort of, maybe I could do it now very quickly. It was a question of how you can, an argument, which I think is a pretty good argument. It's not the greatest, but it's the best I could do in any case. But to demonstrate why affects emanate from subcortical structures. And it began with a set of experiments by Olds and Milner in the 1950s. And what they found was when they zapped, electrically stimulated a part of the hypothalamus called the lateral hypothalamus and some fibers that run through it called the neural front, Jesus, why can't I think of lateral medial forebrain bundle. They found that animals would work very hard for this stimulation, so it was rewarding in some way. Animals only work for reward or to avoid punishment. So what was rewarding about it? And they found out that if they zapped this part of the brain when an animal had food or drink available, it would eat and drink in a very frenzied, ravenous way. So they said, well, this is the neural substrate for homeostasis, because you eat and drink to restore homeostasis. But they found out that animals did all kinds of other things, like they'd gnaw on wood, or they'd gather up their offspring, or they do all kinds of funny things, also in a very compulsive way. And then they found out something even weirder, which is that this neural forebrain bundle and the lateral hypothalamus is actually the neural correlate. It always becomes active when animals are hungry or thirsty. In other words, before they restore homeostasis, when they're in a state of homeostatic imbalance, and that was most confusing. And this is where Jaak was so smart. Jaak, these structures are part of what's called what Jaak calls the seeking system. It extends from the ventral tegmental area in the brainstem up to a pretty high structure called the nucleus accumbens. And it's energized by dopamine, and that's what Jaak calls the seeking system. And what he was saying is the seeking system, it makes you feel good, makes you feel energized when you need to get something. It's before you get it. And this is also a source of great pleasure. And people, this is why people take, meth and cocaine. So once you describe, you say, well, what is the reward involved? It can't be homeostatic. And, I went through a series of sort of a process of elimination. And I said, it had to be affective because it couldn't be anything else. Now that's the weak part of the argument, the elimination, because maybe I missed something. But it opens up two cans of worms. The first can of worms is, well, if homeostasis, in other words, if this system doesn't restore homeostasis, if it's enervated by homeostatic imbalance, what's the relationship between homeostasis and affects? It certainly isn't as straightforward as Damaiso said. And the other thing is mind-body thing, because what you're saying is you have a particular affect, that affect energizes you to eat, drink, search for things, do things. What directs all those activities? Your brain. So in other words, you're saying a non-physical affective state affects your brain. And once you start to do that, you're really enmeshed in the mind-body thing. So
Wonderful.
that was the argument that I put forward, that if you accept it, it validates Jaak, because it says, no, affects emanate from subcortical structures, which all mammals possess, and therefore his experiments are valid.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Michael if he has any comments, and I'm going to put him on speaker here so you can hear it too. Okay.
No more comments here. I just wanted to one more time mention the book here. This is a shortcut to Understanding Affective Neuroscience, which you can find. It's on Amazon. It's on at Barnes and Nobles. So if you like this conversation, if you want to dive more into the sources that Lucy has been citing and all these arguments she has, would definitely recommend you read the book. Her previous book, again, from 2012, You can't really see this very well with the glare here, but the Archaeology of Mind. And I would definitely recommend that as another source for
Let me
this.
be fair about that book. I mean, I helped Jaak with that book, but that's Jaak's book. I'm co-author, but that's Jaak's book. My job was to help him as best I could to get his message across. But anyway, thanks, Michael, for those very thoughtful questions. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for being here and talking to us and elucidating all
can't
of
hear you
our
now.
ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye, everybody.
Okay, so long. Thank you, everyone. Okay,
Bye.
cheerio.
And thanks, Michael.
Okay.